If you can get into that dress, I'll marry you. The words cut through the chandelier light and the hum of conversation like a blade. Laughter rippled around the auction hall, a wave of polished hands and champagne glasses that shimmered and moved as one. Cameras flickered. Someone cheered. At the center of the room, on a raised dais, beneath scaffolded lights, Zahir al-Hakim smiled with the bored cruelty of a man used to flinging other people's lives like confetti. Anya Carter stood 2 rooms away, glow of the kitchen's fluorescent bulbs washing her face in a harsh, unforgiving white. Her uniform was a dark smock streaked with detergent, her hands raw from scrubbing countertops. She had been pushing a broom down the hotel's corridors for 6 years, the rhythm of cartwheels squealing and the smell of cleaning spray marking out her days. Tonight, the glittering charity gala upstairs was both theater and empire. Zahir was the donor, everyone thanked in speeches. He was a name on a plaque, a promise of endowment, a man who showed up to be worshipped. But he had also, in quiet corners of meeting rooms and hotel suites, made a different sort of claim. He had been practiced at lowering people's worlds in private. He was practiced at making others feel small. The bet said loud, said publicly, was meant to finish Anya off with the finale of humiliation. She could almost see the ripple of his amusement as the room filled with it. The dress he had pointed to on a pedestal 2 steps from him was a ribbon of scarlet silk, the kind of garment made to be admired and owned by people who never had to think about how it fit or what it cost. For a moment Anya stood frozen, mop in hand, watching her reflection in the oven's polished metal as if she were seeing 2 people at once: the girl who once sketched seams and saved for fabric, and the woman who had traded a promising future for the steady care of a mother whose hands could no longer fold shirts. Memory came back in the details. The dice-splattered table in a student workshop at Parsons School of Design, the scholarship letter folded into a pocket, the phone call that changed everything, a hospital corridor that smelled of antiseptic and fear. She could have laughed, or sneered, or simply slunk away and let the laughter do its work. Instead, she turned off the overhead light. The kitchen swallowed her as if it had been waiting. She closed the service door behind her and leaned her forehead against cold metal. The laughter upstairs blurred into a single sound, insult and coin all mixed together. Anya closed her eyes. Inside, a voice sharp, young, spoke like a vow. "Not this time," she whispered. "Not like this." That night, a promise anchored itself under the skin. 30 days. She did not say the number aloud at first. The bet was not a formal ultimatum. Zahir had tossed it as a joke, and the joke had landed as laughter. But for Anya it was a measure. It was a date to count toward, a tiny calendar of resolve she could hold against the endless gray of the days she'd been handed. She went home to the small apartment she shared with her mother, pulled out the only thing in the closet that might still fit the thin portfolio she'd kept from design school, and traced the cover with her fingertips, as if the paper would remember the hands that once believed in it. Her backstory did not come neatly wrapped like a narrative people in the auction hall would buy. She had been a scholarship student with talent so natural her tutors often told her not to rush a stitch or a proportion. She had skipped nights of play to work through pattern problems. Then her mother's stroke had rewritten everything. Tuition stopped, rent stacked up, and Anya became a caretaker, then a cleaner, trading a future for a family tether. She learned to find dignity in the small things, folding a fitted sheet into a neat square, creating a crease in a hotel napkin that looked like order. To the outside world she was invisible. To the family she kept upright she was indispensable. The girl who imagined dresses in color and lines still existed, but she had not had space to make anything of it. The mornings that followed were a contrast. Upstairs, the gala faded into memory, and tomorrow's lobby would hold the same glossy faces. Downstairs, Anya began to change the choreography of her life. She rose before sunrise to a cheap gym 2 miles away, a place with cracked mirrors and a trainer named Rita who ran classes like she was building people out of bone and sweat. "You're not rebuilding to please anyone," Rita told her in the dim light of that gym. "You're rebuilding to keep a promise to yourself." That line would anchor Anya when doubt crept in. The montage of her transformation was not cinematic in the way of glossy movies. There was no overnight makeover. There were taped seams and late-night walks through rain. The rhythm of a skipping rope against pavement, Cold porridge eaten, standing on the apartment balcony, the clank of weights in the gym. Anya pushed back. She learned to control her breath, to measure her steps, to hold a posture that did not betray panic when cameras rolled. She went back to the drawings she had once abandoned, sketching the scarlet dress in new light, thinking about how fabric could armor a person the same way determination could. She learned how to present herself without shrinking. If that was the visible work, the other transformation was quieter and more dangerous in an ordinary way. Anya began to pay attention to where power left footprints while she polished the silverware on the banquet table. She listened to the way staff murmured, to the silences between certain names. She began to notice the little things a man like Zahir left behind. A passed-off tablet on a side table, a driver who faded from view after a messy termination, a secretary whose smile had cracks that never fully mended. She was careful not to pry where she could not, mindful of boundaries, consent, and the law. The world she moved in as a cleaner often left still warm Trey Souza, tablet abandoned, an envelope slid into a bin, a door left slightly ajar. She collected what she found visually, always respecting privacy and legality, making notes in a paper notebook rather than trying to capture anything with her phone where she might be accused of tampering. She met Yara Mansour by chance on a trash run behind a service entrance. Yara carried herself like someone who had once been careful to control the narrative of her life and now refused to be ashamed by it. There was a file in her bag with tab dividers. Yara's voice when she spoke of the past was not brittle with anger. It was shaped by fatigue and a stubborn refusal to let injustice be smoothed over with hush money. I documented everything, she said. At first, because I thought it was the only way I could protect myself, then, because no one listened. Yara had been Zahira's secretary. She had collected emails, recorded conversations, and tried to raise concerns that were met with silences and settlements. The settlements had come with non-disclosure agreements that left her feeling traded, but the documentation, meticulous notes, timestamps, discrete copies stayed with her. When Anya mentioned the line from the auction, Yara did not laugh. Instead, she closed her bag and said, "We can do something with this." Jamal arrived in the story like a piece of necessary machinery, quiet, a man who moved pallets and keys and memories like a driver moves through a city. He had been fired from the al-Hakim estate under circumstances he would later describe as punitive and humiliating. He still knew the rhythms of the household, where files tended to accumulate, who handled what, how to get a court-certified copy of something without resorting to anything illegal. He was careful with the language when he offered his help. "I can get legal copies of things," he told Anya. "Properly, through channels." He did not propose trickery or break-and-enter schemes. He proposed paperwork, a lawyer he trusted, and a willingness to put himself on the line. That was dangerous enough. 4 weeks, they worked in small increments. Anya trained with Rita until she could wear the memory of discomfort like a second skin. She sat with Yara and learned to read emails the way a designer reads fabric grain. She met Jamal once in a cafe and handed him a list of dates and events to check. The evidence they assembled was a collage of human testimony and documentary fragments. Emails with suggestive requests, thinly veiled as professional, expense reports that mapped a pattern of favors, recorded voice notes where voices told stories in subtext. They never manipulated anything. They kept chain of custody in mind. Yara and Jamal insisted on a lawyer from the start. The lawyer insisted on proper protocols, on preserving originals, on producing corroborated accounts. "This succeeds," the lawyer said, "by being airtight, not theatrical." They agreed. They traded secrecy for safety. They traded spectacle for a plan. One night, Anya took the red dress down from a quiet closet in the hotel where it had been stored after the auction. She had been careful to arrange to try it on privately to avoid any claim that she had staged the moment. The dress enclosed was both smaller and more intricate than it appeared from the dais. It had a seam that required attention, a strap that refused to sit when moved too quickly. She studied it with professional eyes, smoothing its creases, considering small adjustments. She could have asked Rita to help with posture or design tweaks, but kept this private for a reason. This was not about vanity. This was about proving, first to herself, that she could stand in the room and not be carried off by someone else's dismissal. When she finally slipped the dress over her head in a cramped, humming back room, it fit in that new way of things made to order. Not perfect, but defined by choice and work. She looked at herself in a small mirror and said, not aloud but in a place that felt like prayer, "I did this for me." It was the same voice that had promised herself 30 days. There was a weight in being able to look at a reflection and not have it shaped by other people's laughter. As their plan solidified, they moved with the caution of people who knew how quickly a narrative could be turned against those who had the least power. Yara called other women who had been hurt, their voices threaded through the week like a chorus that refused to be silenced. Sarah Chun, Nina Rodriguez, Ila Alst, each brought a different kind of courage. Some had signed settlements. Some had held complaints in private for years. Together, they formed not a mob, but a council. They met in kitchens and quiet offices, passing around tea and accounts, binding their stories not for revenge, but for accountability. They chose their lawyer, they cataloged evidence, and they rehearsed what public testimony would look like. They discussed the practical outcomes they sought, not only acknowledgement but also institutional changes, policies at the schools and funds for survivors, a scholarship that would allow women like them to return to opportunities denied. All the while, Zahir al-Hakim continued to be the center of his own life. He signed press releases, accepted awards, and smiled on camera. He had built an empire around being indispensable to institutions that wanted his money without his scrutiny. He had also cultivated the immunity that wealth often affords: lawyers, donors, a network of people who deferred to his name. The group knew the difficulty of the task: to bring a man skilled in buying silence into a spotlight where silence would no longer suffice. The night of their intervention was chosen for both symbolism and logistics. Another charity event, another room with glittering faces, the red dress scarcely more than fabric on display sat under a square of light. Anya's team arranged seating for a few journalists who had agreed to hold their questions until the end, and they made sure legal counsel was present to be visible. A reminder that this was intended as lawful disclosure, not a spectacle. Jamal, who had been nervous every step of the way, wore a suit that still smelled faintly of car leather and exhaust. Yara's hands trembled, and Sarah and Nina kept each other's hands between course and course. Anya walked into the room like someone who had rehearsed every step but refused to perform. The red dress on the pedestal might have been the same as before, but the room saw it differently, not as a prize to be possessed but as a prop in a moral test. Conversations hummed, forks clinked. The band played low. When Zahir noticed her, the movement across his face was imperceptible for a heartbeat, then a flash of amusement. He could not know how carefully the night had been set, how many people carried documentation like armor in their bags. "Well," he called across, loud enough for the nearest cameras, "can you get into that dress? Will you marry me?" He punctuated the joke with a broad laugh that expected the crowd to echo it. Anya crossed the room with a silence that felt louder than applause. People turned, some with the same hungry interest that gets directed at a punchline, others with the smaller curiosity reserved for a story that's about to be interesting. She reached the pedestal, feeling the weight of so many years as if it were another dress to shift. She took the dress off its stand and carried it to a small service hallway prepared in the hotel, just for this anonymity, placed like a gift. There, with legal counsel and a few witnesses waiting in an adjacent room, she changed. She stepped back into the main hall as Zahir began his routine of affable disapproval. "Ah," he said, seeing her. "Well, this must be a joke." The room exhaled, expecting a bow, expecting the comedy to continue. Anya held the microphone as if it were a tool she had bought herself with work. Her voice was steady, not theatrical. She did not shout accusations or try to raise the room with rhetoric. Instead, she delivered a simple inventory of truth. She spoke of the humiliation the joke had been designed to deliver, but she also spoke of dignity and choice. When she explained that she was wearing the dress by her own right and because she had earned the right to speak, the room hung on her sentences. Then they played the files. A recording, clear and undeniable, filled the hall with the dry, ordinary sounds of conversation that had been repurposed into evidence. Emails flashed across screens. Requests thinly veiled as help that suggested a pattern. A private message that made a proposition and was refused. Expense documents tied to favors. The thread of small cruelties, stitched together, made a larger seam. Journalists reached for notebooks. Someone in the back murmured, "So much for donations." Phones came alive in pockets, and a room that had been animated by glamour found itself animated by the gravity of what it had just heard. Zahir's smile thinned. For the first time in public he did not have a ready joke. There were questions now, not rhetorical, but real. Reporters raised hands. People leaned forward, the way you lean into a sound that promises to rearrange something you thought was settled. Security moved, not with force, but with nervousness. "What you are seeing," said the lawyer, calmly, into the microphone, "is corroborated material presented to demonstrate a pattern. We have copies in legal custody, and we have witnesses willing to testify." The phrasing was deliberate, precise. It framed the revelation as a public accounting, not a crusade. There was a moment when Zahir tried to regain composure, to turn it into theater. "This is inadmissible in court," he began, voice leveling, lawyers at his shoulder forming a shield. But the room no longer wanted theater. It wanted accountability. The tide had shifted. Footage that had been recorded, uploaded by bystanders, and then amplified on social platforms, moved like a storm through the internet. The video of Anya standing in the red dress and then laying out the facts was straightforward and devastating in its ordinary clarity. A woman in a dress, telling her story with the sound of evidence behind her. Media outlets ran with it. Hashtags formed like tiny flags planted in the ground. Donor lists were scanned in real time by institutions that had relied on Zahir's largesse. Boards quietly convened. A company withdrew its name from an event sponsored under the al-Hakim Foundation. Another university announced a review of past donations and policies. This was not instantaneous punishment. It was public pressure applied to brittle reputations. The legal system moved at its own pace, but the reputational consequences unfolded as the clip was shared, discussed, and dissected. In the immediate aftermath, there were statements, not apologies, so much as evasive proclamations that would later be scrutinized for what they omitted. Zahir's empire did not collapse overnight, it frayed. Contracts were paused, an advisory role was resigned, and an internal review commenced in one of the institutions that had once announced him as a philanthropic paragon. Investigations were opened, not with the fanfare of trial, but with the sober mechanics of process. The law took its steps. Journalists took theirs. There was a reckoning, public and private, that unfolded over weeks rather than a single headline. For the women involved, the consequences were complicated and real. Some found vindication in the public recognition of their experiences. Some felt the old wounds reopen under the glare of commentary. Anya found herself answering questions from reporters, not because she wanted to become a talking head, but because she had chosen to make the choice public. Yara described how the weight of non-disclosure agreements had been like a clamp on the throat. Releasing them, even through the press, felt like breathing. Jamal, for his part, watched as the man who had once been his employer tried to reposition himself in the public eye. Jamal's role, quietly offered and carefully managed, meant he faced his own anxieties. He had acted through legal channels to secure copies that corroborated witness statements. He had not broken the law, but his name now appeared in headlines he had never wanted. He handled the attention with a dignity that surprised even him. Anya's life did not return to what it had been. The hotel hired temporary staff to cover the sudden scrutiny in their public image. Some colleagues treated her with a nervous reverence, others with a wary distance. Her mother, who had been watching the news from bed, cried the first time she saw Anya on television wearing the dress. "You did what you had to," her mother said, the line breaking as it always did. There were interviews, yes, but there were also quieter consequences. Offers from an institution with an admissions committee that had watched the coverage and wanted to extend an invitation. Agencies reaching out with offers to help start a line of clothing inspired by the women's stories. And messages from strangers who had been through similar experiences and found courage in Anya's visibility. The most important outcomes were not the public retractions or the cancelled contracts, but the constructive ones shaped around rebuilding. The Boston School of Design reached out with a scholarship offer anchored not in pity but in principle. The chance for Anya to finish what she had once had to pause. It was a quiet, bureaucratic letter with a big implication. It meant she could enroll again, on terms that would support her caregiving responsibilities, and that there would be funding dedicated to women in precarious positions. Institutional correction shaped by the experience they had forced into public view. Beyond Anya's scholarship, there was a movement toward collective repair. The women who had come forward channeled the publicity into something with a longer shelf life than outrage. They worked with legal advocates to create a fund for survivors that would help cover legal counseling costs for those who could not afford them. They partnered with existing nonprofits to push for clearer policies at schools and cultural institutions on handling allegations against donors and to create channels that would not punish the people who spoke up. The aim was not to tear down but to rebuild, a fellowship for former students who had been forced out of study by caregiving duties. A mentorship program that paired working-class women with industry sponsors who pledged ethical oversight, and an NGO to fund safety nets when non-disclosure agreements had been used to buy silence. Inside all this practical work there was a quieter, personal reconstruction for Anya. She returned to class with a portfolio that now included a line she had designed while working nights and training days. The collection pieces inspired by women she had met in service corridors, women who wore uniforms with dignity and who wanted to be Sanwan, a small but meaningful exhibition. She named the collection Thresholds because each piece was about the line between service and belonging. The thin seam where dignity is made visible. Time, too, reshaped the narrative. Zahir, in a letter that circulated later, attempted a reflective tone. It was a short piece, its language careful and full of counsel-led phrases. I regret how some of my actions were perceived. The letter read in part, I have heard the voices that were silenced and I am sorry. The letter arrived after legal counsel had made processes clear and after the media had done its work of shining light on documentation. For many of the women involved, the letter landed like a small, late consolation, insufficient, but also a mirror that could be used to reflect a lesson. Anya read the lines and folded the paper into the inner pocket of her coat. She did not burn it. She did not plaster it on a wall. She slid it into a file with others and moved on. There were moments of temptation toward vengeance, the kind of private fantasies that visit those who have been hurt. But the group had discussed that from the start. They did not want to be consumed by the desire to see one man fall. They wanted systems altered so that others would not have to play the same role in silence. They wanted their names to stand for integrity instead of shame. So they put energy into structuring a different kind of outcome. A scholarship in the names of those who had been pushed out of education, an advisory council at cultural institutions to review donor agreements with an ethic of protecting vulnerable people, funds for legal support and mental health. They turned humiliation into infrastructure. The epilogue of Anya's story does not end with a single image of triumph or complete closure. Life rarely offers such neat punctuation. Instead, it offers a long, steady blur of days in which small successes accumulate. Anya walked across a stage to accept her scholarship formally. The applause, not the brittle clap of a gala, but the warm, steady hand clap of peers who had seen work and dedication. She presented a short speech about thresholds and asked the audience to imagine institutions that did not make silence a currency. At the reception afterwards, her designs hung like built to be worn and moved in Anne. She talked quietly with students who had not known their own possibilities until someone else made space for them. The NGO that emerged from their work had modest offices at first, second-floor rooms, donated time, a string of volunteers who had never expected to be this invested. It funded emergency legal aid, assisted with mental health counseling, and offered workshops on navigating institutional spaces without being exploited. It created a scholarship fund for women like Anya, those who had to choose caregiving over craft and needed a bridge back. They set up mentorship programs that connected established designers with women who had been pushed out. Each success was small, but it was real. There were other ripples. An institution revised its donor policy, a board member resigned, in light of what the review uncovered about how Islamic influence could be prioritized over safety. Conversations began in circles that had once been closed. None of these were miraculous reversals. They were adjustments, slow and necessary, the kind you make when you have realized that a structure has been built on the wrong foundation. Years later, someone found the letter from Zahir tucked in the file. It was more reflective now, less evasive in tone, and included a line that read, "What I once thought of as harmless jokes, I now see could cause harm." For Anya, it was a sentence that held all the limitations of apology, admission without full reparation. She kept the letter anyway, folded into the archive of what had happened. It was a reminder that people could change their language. Institutions could change policy, but dignity was ultimately something enacted by those who held it, not granted by the powerful. On the day of her first small fashion show as a designer, Anya walked past the hotel where she had once worked. The service door was closed and ordinary, the cartwheels silent that morning. She paused at the threshold and did not enter. She did not need to. The memory of the fluorescent bulbs, the smell of cleaner, the rhythm of scrubbing did not haunt her. They had been teacher and testament. She stepped away and toured an atelier where students gathered, and where the scholarship fund she helped start would support a new generation. The final moral of her story was not vindication in the sense of watching a powerful man suffer. It was rather about building a different kind of power. The power to create institutions that protect and nurture, the power to transform humiliation into a platform for change, the power to keep working when the glare has passed and the work remains. Dignity, as Anya learned, is both a claim and an offering. Claim it, build with it, and make space for the people who will come after. If this story moved you, like, share, and subscribe. If you want to help create safer spaces for survivors and students, look in the description for links to organizations doing that work and consider supporting their efforts. Stand for dignity.